Welcome and thank you for standing by. This call is being recorded. If you object to that, you may disconnect at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to our webinar on doing business in Vietnam. My name is Lavea Razizi, and I'm a Senior International Trade Specialist for the Global Knowledge Center for Global Markets at the Department of Commerce. And this webinar is being brought to you in cooperation by the Global Knowledge Center and the Foreign Commercial Service for the Department of Commerce. This webinar will talk about the demographics, the people, government, economy, trade and political environment, education, and best prospects, as well as the power, oil, gas, and healthcare, water, and wastewater industry in Vietnam. Our main speaker for today is Mr. Bill Marshak, who is the Commercial Officer of Hanoi, Vietnam. And with that, I would like to introduce you live online from Washington, D.C., and also from Hanoi, Vietnam, Mr. Bill Marshak. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to Doing Business in Vietnam. We hope this presentation will be helpful to you as you consider this rapidly growing market. Vietnam is a long, narrow country, some 1,000 miles from top to bottom as the crow flies, and with a coastline of something like 2,000 miles. You can see on the map that Ho Chi Minh City is in the south and the largest city and main commercial hub. Some 70% of economic output is coming from the 5 or 6 provinces immediately adjacent to Ho Chi Minh City. Hanoi is the capital and the second largest commercial center, about 700 miles north in a straight line from Ho Chi Minh City, and in the middle is Da Nang, the third largest city. And to some extent, each represent a different market. Based on population, Vietnam is the 13th largest country in the world. This particular slide shows it is number 14, but that's because the European Union has been lumped in as one country. But in fact, it's number 13, and as such, has considerable potential as a market. The other striking demographic about Vietnam is the youth of the population, with a median age of under 30. These are demographics for growth. A large population, a young population, a growing workforce with good basic literacy, and a young consumer base driving a new emerging middle class. Vietnam is ruled by the Communist Party of Vietnam and divided into 63 provinces and special municipalities. Prime Minister Dom and President Sang have both traveled to the United States as recently as 2013. The next party Congress in 2016 will choose new leaders. There are a number of relevant milestones to understanding the U.S.-Vietnam commercial relationship. I'd like to point out a few of these. First of all, in 1986, the government of Vietnam instituted the policy of Doi Moi, or reform, which opened up, or should say rather began to open up the economy both domestically and internationally, and marks the start of a new approach to economics on behalf of the government here. In 1994, the United States lifted trade restrictions on Vietnam, and in 1995, the two countries established full diplomatic relations. Next year will mark the 20th anniversary of those reestablishment of relations. In 2001, Vietnam and the United States implemented a bilateral trade agreement, which really kick-started our trade relationship. In 2001, two-way trade was only about $1.5 billion US. By 2002, it had doubled to almost $3 billion, and now in 2013, we have crossed or are crossing the $30 billion mark. I first came to Vietnam in 2006, in the middle of a decade where Vietnam was experiencing a growth rate of 7 to 8% for some 7 or 8 years running. In 2008, with the world economic crisis, the economy here slowed and struggled for a while with high inflation, slower growth, and a deflated real estate market. 2013 saw considerably more stability and growing business confidence, with inflation generally viewed as under control and GDP starting to tick up. This slide is simply a comparison across the region of key economic factors. You see that Vietnam stands somewhere in the middle in many ways. Coming back to focus on U.S.-Vietnam trade, you can see that we exported approximately $5 billion worth of goods in 2013 and imported almost $25 billion from Vietnam. The U.S. exports saw a significant growth in agricultural products, accounting for some 47% of U.S. exports to Vietnam. Industrial inputs also continue to see steady growth as Vietnam continues to import machinery, chemicals, instrumentation, and software to support a growing industrial sector. On the other side of the trade flow, Vietnam's primary exports to the U.S. were apparel and accessories, fish and other marine products, leather and allied products, including shoes, and electronics, furniture, and ag products. You can see here that our trade with Vietnam puts us at about only 15% of trade with other ASEAN countries, but it's growing fast. Why Vietnam? First of all, the demographics are there for growth and therefore represents a very good potential trade partner and market. It is fundamentally stable politically. Real incomes are rising, and there is a great receptivity to U.S. products and services. There is also a growing market for U.S. inputs to the industrial sector. For example, Vietnam may produce and export a large volume of farm-raised seafood, but those fish may well have been raised on U.S. feed grains. Likewise, high-end furniture for export may well use American hardwoods. And of course, we are players in industrial machinery for all types of industry as well. That aside, there's also a very fast-growing consumer market, everything from iPhones to McDonald's, and again, U.S. brands are very well perceived. The good news in 2013 was that inflation was down and really under control and no longer seemed to be a great worry to anyone. Currency is fundamentally stable, although it was just devalued in mid-2014. The real estate market, although still weak, was seen as beginning to stabilize, with hopes that that would also soak up some bad debt in the banking system. GDP growth rate was ticking upward again, and the general increase in business confidence. Some challenges. Underlying challenges include an economy where inefficient state-owned enterprises still occupy a larger space than they should. And there are attempts at top government levels to privatize some of those state-owned enterprises, but they still present an inefficiency. There are some fears of non-performing loans in the banking system and bottlenecks in the power supply and transportation infrastructure. The education system in Vietnam, although it produces a widespread general literacy, seems to still have some problems producing the types of skills that companies coming in engineering and management and healthcare need, and therefore there's also a human resources bottleneck. The legal system is still new and developing, which feeds into the question of transparency and corruption. And for U.S. companies competing on major projects, much of the financing comes from official development assistance. In other words, cheap money coming from other countries, and makes it very difficult for us to compete. On the ease of doing business scale, you can see that under electricity, as I noted, Vietnam ranks quite low, and it's in the middle on many of the other factors. Best prospects. Power generation, transmission, distribution, obviously, because there's a great need for more electric power. Telecoms are very strong. Airports and aviation is a fast-growing sector, both in terms of in terms of commercial aviation, passenger traffic, and airport development and safety. Healthcare and medical equipment is huge. Again, a population of 90 million that are demanding better healthcare and looking for better opportunities. Other sectors we see as important are environmental technologies, industrial machinery, renewable energy. Education is big, and we're beginning to see franchising as an important part of the economy. Moving to these individually, power generation is an area where the U.S. and U.S. technologies can play a role. We've got technologies that fit what Vietnam needs. Rapid industrialization is driving fast growth. The current master plan in place in 2011 seeks to increase power generation by more than six-fold by 2030. And as you can see from this graph, we're starting to see the beginnings of a nuclear power industry with 2 nuclear power plants on the books down south in Ninh Thuận province, and probably more to follow after that. Hydropower is about tapped out, and therefore a lot of the gap is going to unfortunately be taken up by coal. Gas power will also be important, as there is major gas lines offshore. So there is a role for U.S. technologies in all of this. You can see here that the major player in power generation is Electricity of Vietnam, the great bulk of power generation. The second is Petro Vietnam, the state-owned company that is responsible for oil and gas, and then a number of other smaller players. Oil and gas is a major source of national income. It's a large chunk of the GDP. It's growing fast. There's oil and gas offshore. There's a great market for services associated with that, exploration and recovery and exploitation. The next sector I'm moving to would be infotech, ICT. Again, the growing industrialization is driving a need for increased investment in IT industry, plus a very plugged-in population. I think internet penetration is now probably around 40%. So the country's very much online, and so from every level of society, there's a great demand for ICT. Vietnam, at the same time, is becoming a player in that handsets, telephone handsets, are now surpassing the value of apparel exports from Vietnam, largely because of South Korean investments in the handset business in Vietnam. Moving to healthcare, again, you've got a growing population, an increasingly affluent population, and a healthcare system that is a bit behind. There is a need for all kinds of inputs. 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in Vietnam are imported, as is most medical equipment. It's a very competitive market, but it's a big market nevertheless. There's also a need for hospital design, hospital management, and a fast-growing market for those wealthy enough to afford premium care. I've heard a figure of Vietnamese spending over $1 billion in medical tourism to neighboring countries, especially Singapore and Thailand. If there were, how should we say, more upscale facilities here in Vietnam, that might stay here at home, and that's another place where U.S. technologies can play a role. Water and wastewater, the environmental technologies, is also a rather important sector for the simple reason that as Vietnam has rapidly industrialized, they have failed to keep up with their water treatment needs. Some 75% of industrial wastewater is released untreated. Clean water does not meet demand. So there's a great need in this sector. The money will largely be coming from development banks and ODA for ODA projects. That's official development assistance. And again, competitive projects, but nevertheless a very important sector where the U.S. has a great deal to offer. We always encourage Vietnamese entities to visit major shows in this sector in the U.S. because we see it as a key market. We'll also say something about the education market for Vietnam. Again, you've got such a large young population and a great respect for education under the traditional Confucian Vietnamese society. Vietnam has now become the 8th largest source of overseas students to the United States. There's some 16,000 Vietnamese students studying in the United States at present, and there's considerable interest in joint programs with U.S. schools and institutions here in Vietnam. For example, a number of U.S. business schools have set up joint programs with Vietnamese universities, and Vietnam will continue to send students to the U.S. in large numbers. Last of all, let me mention the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Vietnam became a full member of the TPP negotiations in 2010, and although at this moment the negotiations are not complete, we foresee considerable benefits to U.S. companies under the TPP in terms of increased market access, an improved investment climate, improved standards throughout the Vietnamese economy, and just generally an easier time for U.S. companies doing business here. On behalf of Global Markets and the Foreign Commercial Service, I would like to say thank you. We are here to assist U.S. business in Vietnam from our offices in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. We hope to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for your presentation. And this concludes our webinar on doing business in Vietnam. Thank you and goodbye. Sydney?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Bill. Yeah, perfect.
Linda?
Yeah,
Is it
I just
okay?
hope she ended the recording. Yeah.
Well, they can always cut it off.
Yeah, you're right, and that's what I think too.
They can always cut it off. Okay, that was okay.
Thank you so much. And
next
have
year,
a good.
well, I'm sorry I was so slow at it. I've done things like this before for radio and video, and I usually like to do a few full practice runs, and I'm a little rusty, but that's okay. It'll work. And I thank you for your patience. Hello?